Hey everybody, this is Jeff Miller here, Head of Instruction at Target Test Prep. Today I have a very exciting video that I want to chat with everybody about, and it's a question that's hitting test takers everywhere. Is the GMAT focus harder than the current version of the GMAT or the classic GMAT? So let's get into that during today's video. Point number one, let's discuss is the percentiles of each exam. This has been widely discussed. I want to just say off the top, it's not that big of a deal. I wouldn't go crazy thinking about these percentiles of whether the test is harder or easier for you when comparing focus versus classic GMAT. But here's what we know. The top score of the classic GMAT is an 800. The top score of GMAT focus is an 805. If we drop down 100 points to a 700 on the classic GMAT, the 87th percentile. And if you drop down 100 points from an 805 on GMAT focus, that's actually the 99th percentile. So based on that, we see that 13% of the classic GMAT test takers score higher than 700. And right now, GMAT is expecting only 1% of the GMAT focus test takers to score higher than a 705. So just based on that side-by-side comparison, one would say, well, yeah, that means GMAT focus is harder. But here's the rub here, and here's what we've been trying to teach our students and administrators and admissions. Everybody's got to get with the program that lower scores on the GMAT focus are going to be better than what you would see from the classic GMAT. So for example, a score of 685 on the GMAT focus, it's not that bad of a score. It actually corresponds to a much higher score in the classic GMAT, but people have to start realizing that, because right now, if you were to get a 680 on classic GMAT, you may say, well, that's not enough for a top 10 business school, but rather a 685 on the focus actually is. So what's the net result of all this? I don't think you need to worry too much about comparing the percentiles, and we'll get into more about why in this video. Right now, you just need to focus on what your goal score needs to be in the GMAT focus if you're taking it, and make sure that lines up with what admissions wants to see from you. From what I've seen from TTP students is people who would have done very well in classic are doing really, really well in GMAT focus. We've had a ton of plus 700 scores, so I think the transition from one exam to the other isn't bad. So what I'm trying to say is don't worry too much about the percentiles, just focus on mastering the exam. Point number two I want to discuss is the differences between the two exams, and then we'll get into detail of each section and how that's helpful for you. Now, the main differences. Focus has 3 sections. They all count towards your total score equally. Data insights, which is data sufficiency, which is basically math stuff, and integrated reasoning. And then we've got our verbal, which is just critical reasoning, reading comprehension. Whereas on classic, the verbal is sentence correction, critical reasoning, reading comprehension. And then math. In focus, it's just problem solving. In classic, it's problem solving and data sufficiency. So those are some of the main differences. Others are the data sufficiency questions in GMAT focus. Those are not going to be dealing with any sort of complex math, any sort of math such as algebra, where you have to determine the value of X or Y, or is X even or odd. Anything like that, any pure math data sufficiency is gone from focus. And then geometry, that's also gone from focus. That's not a part of the math section anymore. And as I mentioned earlier, sentence correction is gone from the verbal side. So what I want to do now is I want to dig in to each of those 3 sections to discuss the differences and how they might help or hurt you. Section number 1 I want to talk about is data insights on the GMAT focus versus the integrated reasoning section on classic GMAT. As I said, those 3 sections all count evenly. So now data insights really matters compared to integrated reasoning, which kind of doesn't. It's that side score in classic GMAT. No one really looks at it. So what does that mean? Well, it means it's important now. But I have good news. Learning it isn't bad. You've got, well, data sufficiency is one thing, and that's a new addition to the data insights section. Data sufficiency is basically can be learned alongside quant. So it's really not that bad. Remember, as I said, no more pure math data sufficiency questions though. So they're just going to be based on topics like word problem based topics, rates, work, ratios, statistics, etc. There's not going to be that many of them. On the classic GMAT, data sufficiency got into pure math, number properties, inequalities, absolutes, things like that. You won't really see those on GMAT Focus. So that could be an advantage for you. If you didn't like the pure math stuff on classic, then that's going to be helpful on Focus. The big thing I want to talk about with data insights is the fact that IR is now a really integral part of your score, whereas before, as I said, it wasn't. But here's the good news. If you're worried about that, it's not that bad. Why? It's based up of so much of what you learn from GMAT Quant and GMAT Verbal. Here's why. Think about it. You've got graphic interpretation, mostly math-based section, dealing with, yes, you have to be able to read graphs, but you're talking about questions on stats, percents, ratios, etc. Table analysis, another math-based section. A lot of questions on ratios, stats, percents, etc. Then you've got TPA math. That's based on things across the board. You can get rates, you can get work, combinations, ratios, even some word problem algebra-based stuff. So my point is, if you learn all that on the front end of your studying and you nail it with quant, then you're going to be in a great spot. You're just going to have to get used to that question type, which means it's actually a nice thing that's now going to be more important. So despite being a third section, there's not a ton of extra legwork you have to do to master it. And then you move on to MSR and TPA Verbal. That's largely based on things that you're doing in critical reasoning. This is all very good news because if you go through math and crush it, if you go through verbal and crush it, and then you move to data insights, I promise you it's not going to be that bad. So when we say, hey, is Focus harder based on that? I would like to say no. I think it's easier because it's giving you more weight on something that you can master well before you even start it. Now let's talk about the two math sections. Classic GMAT, as we said, you've got data sufficiency, you've got problem solving, and remember, data sufficiency contains pure math and geometry. On Focus, we don't have data sufficiency. That got pushed to the DI section, the data insights section. And, on the classic GMAT, you do have geometry. And then in Focus, no geometry. Talked to a lot of TTP students. Many of them say, I don't love learning all those geometry formulas. That's a lot of work for only a couple questions. So that is a plus for the GMAT Focus exam, right? That probably will make it a little bit easier. It's a massive topic that you don't have to now study for and a ton of formulas you don't have to remember. That's not a bad thing. Now, next, it's just problem solving in the Focus versus both data sufficiency and problem solving in the classic GMAT. I don't think one is necessarily easier or harder than the other. The only thing I'll say is that in the GMAT Focus, because data sufficiency is gone, you just have to focus on one problem type, whereas in classic, you don't. And we've already talked about no geometry. So net, I don't necessarily think one is that much harder than the other, but it's always good not to have to learn as much stuff. So again, on GMAT Focus, comparing the classic math or the math section of classic, it might be a little bit easier because there's actually less you have to study. Now let's discuss the two verbal sections. Classic GMAT, SC, sentence correction, CR, critical reasoning, RC, reading comp, Focus, just CR and RC. All right, not bad. That means we eliminated one whole section. I do understand that there are folks out there who like sentence correction. Yes, I liked it too. I think it's a pretty cool section because it actually has a lot of life skills that you can take on and keep using after the GMAT, but it's a whole nother thing to study. And critical reasoning and reading comp are kind of related. If you can master CR, you can carry over some of those skills to RC, and as I said before, also MSR. So I think, in my opinion, that actually probably makes the Focus a little bit easier. Now, if you're crushing sentence correction and that's helping you bring up your verbal score, you might think otherwise. But overall, just based on pure study time, it is helpful to have to study less stuff, just like with math. So GMAT did want to make this test a little bit more manageable to prepare for. And as you can see from the verbal to the quant section, they kind of have achieved that. So when you look at the verbal section, unless you're just a master of sentence correction, it could make preparing for GMAT Focus that much easier versus the classic GMAT. So what's our conclusion? Well, if you look at the percentiles, it seems like GMAT is kind of saying, hey, this test is going to be harder than the classic GMAT. But remember, those percentiles can change, and what schools expect you to score to get into their programs based on the focus we're seeing is much lower than the classic GMAT. So I wouldn't really worry about the percentile rankings. And as a side note, we've had a lot of target test prep students crushing GMAT focus. I'm talking plus 700 scores, high 600 scores, scores that will get you into top 10 schools. So from what we have seen, the transition from classic to focus has been very easy and students have had no issues with it. From the content side, as I said, less stuff to study. No more geometry, no more sentence correction, no more AWA, and a lot of transferable skills to the data insight section, which now matters. So with all that in mind, and with the classic GMAT coming to an end, I think you shouldn't be worried about GMAT focus. And if you've been studying for classic and need to make the switch, I don't think the pivot is that bad. So I would say that the GMAT focus is not harder than the classic GMAT, and I think it's in line with it, and based on the content you have to study, even easier. So that is a wrap on today's video. I had a blast talking about, is the GMAT focus harder than the classic GMAT? I hope you got a lot out of it, and hopefully you're slowly starting to move into your study routine of moving towards the focus GMAT, because you know that the classic is wrapping on January 31st. As always, if you like the video, please subscribe, leave comments if you want us to make more videos, and come over to TTP. We're always happy to help. So let's get going on your GMAT. And until next time, happy studying, everybody.